This is the brand new Sony Bravia 8 projector, which promises to be one of the best native 4K laser projectors on the market for your home theater. Does it deliver on that promise? Let's discuss. The Bravia 7 projector will be paired to a Seymour Screen Excellence 110-inch acoustically transparent Enlightor Neo screen with a 1.0 gain. And it's important to note that the Bravia 8 has not been professionally calibrated for this review. All observations are based on its out-of-the-box performance with various picture profiles. In this review, we'll cover settings, specs, resolution, brightness, contrast in HDR, black levels, and we'll do some side-by-side comparisons to Sony's XR video processing and madVR NV Cores processing. Demos will be played back on a Kaleidoscape and an Oppo UDP 203 4K Blu-ray player, and I'm using an 8K Ruri Pro HDMI cable. As far as specs, the Bravia 8 projector has a brightness of 2700 lumens, it supports HDR10, it has a native resolution of 3840 by 2160, it has a laser light source of 20,000 hours, infinite contrast ratio with dynamic contrast. It has a refresh rate of 120 Hz. It supports the HDMI standard 2.1, has a 16.9 widescreen aspect ratio, and the projected distance is up to 300 inches. As far as build quality, the Bravia 8 has a sleek, dark, and robust design with an angular form factor and a prominent protruding front lens. For connectivity, the projector is well equipped with two HDMI 2.1 and HDCP 2.3 compliant ports, which is going to give you support for all those high bandwidth video games if you care about that. You also have support for IP control and networking, an infrared mini jack, a LAN port for network control and updates. There's support for RS-232 for integration with control systems. There's a mini jack trigger with a max of DC 12 volt, a USB Type-A for firmware updates or accessory power. In terms of physical dimensions, the Sony Bravia 8 projector is considered a compact projector, coming in at a width of 18 inches, a height of 8 inches, and a depth of 20 inches. And it weighs in at 31 pounds. When you open up the menu, the first section you'll be greeted with is the picture section. So if we scroll over to the right, we have some presets. So you have Cinema Film 1, Film 2, Reference TV, Photo Game, Bright Cinema, Bright TV User, and IMAX Enhanced. Now for this review, I'm only going to be focusing on Cinema Film 1 and 2, as well as Reference and then Bright Cinema. All the other presets, you're probably not going to be using those watching movies, and I don't have any IMAX Enhanced content. Then you have Reset, you have Reality Creation, you can turn that on or off. You have Cinema Black Pro, so you've got Cinema Black Pro, you've got Dynamic HDR Enhancer off or on, and then your laser light setting. Right now I have it set to max for this review. And then dynamic control, you can change that from full, limited, or off. So I have everything on full. So pretty much for this review, I have everything maxed out on the settings, certain settings, just to see what the projector is capable of when you really push it. Dynamic HDR Enhancer, you have low, middle, and high. I am using high for this review. You have motion flow on or off. I typically leave that off. You have contrast, max, brightness, color, hue, color temperature, sharpness, and expert setting. Sharpness, I typically keep that at 0, but when I'm using this for the madVR, it is recommended to put this on 15. But for most of the content that's not, where I'm not using the madVR, I have the sharpness all the way down to 0. Then on expert setting, you have noise reduction, smooth gradation, gamma correction, color correction, HDR, color space, and input lag. So for most of this stuff, I turn it off. HDR, I believe I kept this on auto. It's off right now because it's not displaying any HDR content with the Kaleidoscape on the home screen. But I typically just keep this on auto. And then color space, you've got BT709, BT2020, color space 1, 2, 3, custom. And if you scroll down, you have your screen section. So you can set the aspect ratio from normal, aspect ratio scaling, V-stretch, squeeze if you're using a anamorphic lens. And then you've got blanking. You can turn that on or off. Next you have your setup, so you can change the different settings here. Not really going to focus on this too much. It's pretty self-explanatory. Then you have your function section. So for dynamic range, you can change that on both HDMI ports to auto, limited, or full. I typically put this on full. You have HDMI signal format. So I keep this on enhanced format, and this is also recommended by madVR if you're going to be using a madVR, but you have enhanced format and standard. And then you have your settings lock where you can turn that on or off. Then you have your corner keystone, so you can adjust. If you need to adjust the keystone, you've got 4 corners. You select that, you'll see that you can adjust that pretty drastically. So we're going to put that back. But if you needed to, you could do all 4 corners. So you have the option. This is not recommended. You'll be using the usable pixels. So try to get it on screen, your image on your projector screen as close as possible without having to use this. Then you have your image flip. You can select the settings for anamorphic lens, trigger, infrared receiver front and rear. You have your panel alignment. So if you need to adjust, you can hit adjust, and then you can do shift, you can adjust the color, you can do the pattern, color, RGB. And then you have your network setting. So then you have your information, you have the model number, serial number, you have your color format, it'll tell you what's being outputted, the color space, software version, light timer, and intake air temperature. And that is it for the settings. For viewing, I've put Sony's light output to 100% and maxed out all of the HDR settings to see how far we can push the XR processor and how accurate it is with HDR content. Now let's get into the crucial aspect of HDR performance, starting with the HDR Heavy Movie Alpha from Kaleidoscape. We'll examine how its 4 movie watching profiles renders HDR10 content. Cinema Film 2 appears to be the most accurate in reproducing the director's intent. The detail on the sun's rays and the surrounding clouds is excellent, and the overall image is well balanced. Cinema Film 1 is just behind Cinema Film 2 with a slight loss of detail in the sky and a tad lighter overall image. The reference profile looks a little closer in HDR performance to Cinema Film 2, but adds a bit more brightness on the horizon. Bright Cinema, as its name suggests, is too bright and tends to blow out the highlights compared to the other 3 profiles. A freeze frame comparison of all 4 profiles reveals how each profile attempts to reproduce such a challenging HDR scene, which even the best TVs tend to struggle with. Again, Cinema Film 2 looks the most accurate, and you can clearly see how Bright Cinema blows out the highlights completely. Next, let's assess how each profile handles contrast with deep blacks and bright objects simultaneously, like fire and stars at night. Cinema Film 2 shines again, appearing the most accurate with contrast, delivering excellent detail in both the brightest and darkest areas of the scene. Cinema Film 1 looks a little flatter than Cinema Film 2, with highlights appearing a tad brighter than necessary. The reference profile appears a little too dark compared to Cinema Film 1 and 2, crushing some of the shadow detail. Bright Cinema just adds too much brightness and displays a noticeable greenish hue. Going back to that greenish hue, If you look at the stars against the backdrop of the pitch black sky and the bright cinema profile, you can really see the image leaning towards green. The reference profile is just way too dark, with most of the stars not even visible, while both Cinema Film 1 and 2 look pretty even and natural. If we look at a shot from Dune Part 2 where the camera does a super close-up shot of Paul's face, we can get an even better look at how the different Sony profiles handle highlights without much darkness in the scene. If you've seen this clip, you know there's a ton of sand behind Paul, and all that light from the sun hitting the sand makes for a super bright scene. Notice how much darker the reference profile renders this scene. Far too dark. Bright blows out the background, but color reproduction still looks pretty decent. What's noticeable about this scene is that there is some shade hitting Paul's face, and Cinema Film 1 and 2 do the best job at accurately reproducing the entirety of this scene, while Cinema Film 2, to no one's surprise, is the most accurate. Now let's pop in the Spears and MUNSIL Ultra HD benchmark disc on the Oppo UDP203 to see how the Sony's XR processor handles different nit levels. We'll look at 1000 nits, 2000 nits, and 10,000 nit material in an HDR10 container, and then I'll compare the Sony's video processing to madVR's video processing at 10,000 nits. At 10,000 nits, all four profiles actually do a pretty good job of preserving detail. Cinema Film 2 looks the cleanest and most accurate, while Bright Cinema appears to be starting to blow out the background and some highlights, with a little loss in detail in the background with trees and hills, and you lose a lot of visibility in the foreground with the grass. But you can still make out plenty of detail. At 2000 nits, I didn't notice too much of a difference. Bright Cinema still looks like it's clipping, but the XR processor is still doing an excellent job at preserving detail across all four profiles. So it's nice to know that the jump from 1000 nits to 2000 nits is not going to have a significant drop in quality in HDR reproduction. It's when you jump to 10,000 nits that you can see how much the XR processor struggles on some of the profiles because it's trying to reproduce such demanding content. At 10,000 nits, you'll notice the highlights are pretty much all blown out completely on the reference and Bright Cinema profiles. Cinema Film 1 is also clipped pretty bad, but still allows you to just barely make out the background, but the highlights are still clipped. The reference profile, while raising the saturation levels and is clipping, you can still make out about 50% of the background with some of the trees. But look at Cinema Film 2. Cinema Film 2 is actually holding its own. There is some loss in detail and the highlights are a little bit clipped, but I'm still seeing a ton of detail and highlights preservation at 10,000 nits. That's pretty impressive for an internal projector processor. For those of you wondering why you'd want to spend the extra cash on a dedicated video processor, let's see how integrating a madVR NV core into the mix compares to Sony's XR processor at 10,000 nits. Again, at 10,000 nits, the reference profile is just way oversaturated and clipped with little but visible detail in the background, while Bright Cinema is just absolutely blown out. Cinema Film 2, however, looks to be on par with the madVR. So while Cinema Film 1 and 2 seem to be the more accurate profiles, with Cinema Film 2 being the most accurate that you'll want to use with the Bravia 8 projector, let's do a side-by-side comparison with the same scene using Cinema Film 1 and 2 profiles against madVR's tone mapping, which also utilizes a tweaked version of the Cinema Film 2 profile. You can see Cinema Film 1 is almost entirely blown out and clipped, with some slight visibility in the background. But for 10,000 nit material, the XR processor isn't doing too bad of a job on this profile. The color of the horses isn't too oversaturated like the Bright Cinema profile, and there's just enough visible detail in the foreground while the snow and grass are more clipped. But if we switch over to the Cinema Film 2 profile, the results are quite impressive. I think it's clear the madVR still wins. However, honestly, on Cinema Film 2 profile in this scene, I'm genuinely not seeing too much of a difference here. The only difference I can make out is the color of the horses is just a bit more saturated and the snow looks to be a brighter shade of white than the madVR. Everything else looks almost dead even. The highlights and detail are pretty even, but again, I am absolutely blown away at how well the Cinema Film 2 profile, out of the box, is handling this tone mapping for 10,000 nit material. But it's when we start adding a bunch of color and contrast that we'll see a massive difference in utilizing a dedicated video processor. As good as Sony's tone mapping is on the Cinema Film 2 profile, this is where a dedicated processor like madVR starts to separate itself from any other video processor. For reference, I connected the Bravia 8 projector to my madVR NV core and follow the Sony Projector Setup Guide on madVR's Online Academy on the YouTube channel. I'll post a link in the description. Looking at the same scenes from Alpha that we viewed earlier, you can clearly see how much more oversaturated the Sony's tone mapping looks compared to the madVR's tone mapping that looks much more natural. Notice the saturation in the skin tones. With the madVR, skin tones look natural, while the Sony's processor adds a more pinkish reddish hue. Even the embers from the fire look more overly saturated than they should, but the madVR keeps everything intact by preserving those natural colors and hues. This again goes back to the director's intent and accurately reproducing content how it was filmed as much as possible. Lastly, let's look at resolution and sharpness. Sony has always been known for its sharp images, and the Bravia 8 has one of the sharpest images for a home theater projector that I've personally seen, and the sharpest in my home theater. If we take Paul's zoom shot from Dune Part 2 and zoom in, we can see the incredible amount of sharpness and detail in Sony's native 4K panel. At 150%, you can still see a ton of detail in his hijab, the texture in his clothing, and the pores on his skin. Even at 200%, the image still looks really good and clean, maintaining excellent clarity and preserving a ton of detail without much artifacts. At 300%, obviously you're going to start seeing some artifacts and pixelation with some loss in detail, but I'd say even at 300%, this doesn't look bad at all. The native 4K panel and XR processor on the Bravia 8 is definitely a nice addition to this new projector lineup. The Sony Bravia 8 projector stands as a testament to Sony's dedication to continued excellence in the home theater space. It offers solid build quality, up-to-date connectivity with HDMI 2.1, and an impressively sharp native 4K image. While it's not the brightest projector on the market, put the Bravia 8 in a light-controlled home theater, and its laser light source will give you more than enough brightness and longevity, and utilizing the impressive Cinema Film 2 profile out of the box is going to give you top-notch dynamic contrast with exceptional black levels. While its internal XR processor does a commendable job with HDR tone mapping across the board, with the highlight being the Cinema Film 2 profile, which is surprisingly capable even with 10,000 nit content. For those seeking the absolute pinnacle of HDR detail and color accuracy, pairing the Bravia 8 with a dedicated processor like the madVR NV Core will unlock its full potential that will extend the nuance and fidelity that is simply unmatched by its world-leading video processing. I am a huge fan of the Bravia 8 projector, and it gets a top pick for home theater projectors in 2025. For those considering the Bravia 8 projector and don't have the time or funds for calibrating, and don't want to dish out the extra cost of a video processor, out of the box on its own, the Bravia 8 is an outstanding projector that delivers a stunning, sharp, and vibrant picture, making it a compelling choice for any serious home theater enthusiast. My only gripe is that at this price point, having to manually focus the lens is just unacceptable. I've had 3 different Epson projectors at various price points, and they've all had digital focus lens. But maybe in future iterations, Sony will give users digital focus. If you want to grab a Sony Bravia 8 projector, get in touch with our channel partner at the Grid Hi-Fi in Houston, Texas, visit the website or give them a call and let them know Hatoraid Cowboy sent you. Links in the description. Let me know what you think of the Sony Bravia 8 projector. And if you found this review helpful, don't forget to like, share, and if you want to see a comparison between the Sony Bravia 8 and the Epson QB1000 projectors to find out which one you should buy for your home theater setup, then subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss that video and any other future home theater related content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.